What I'm here to talk about today is securing your storefront. This is about how to get your first commercial space. One way that we started our community economic development and small business work here was by making sure that we were offering lease reviews for people who were looking at commercial space. And one thing that we found in doing that, or confirmed a suspicion anyway, was that lots of small business owners didn't know where their points were that they can negotiate and work on getting a better lease. And we wanted to kind of get out in front of that and make sure that people were more recognized their power that they've got in going into those. I'm always happy to be with the Women's Business Center and doing presentations with them. Wonderful group. So thank you so much for having me. There are a few things I always like to start with some terms just so that everyone knows what I'm talking about when I throw these around. When I talk about the term of a lease, that's usually going to mean the length of it, whether you'll see a lot of commercial leases, maybe 3 years or 5 years, or sometimes you've got pop-ups where it's going to be a 30-day. So that term is always an important one. If I fall back into saying lessee and lessor, which I'm really going to try not to do because those are terrible words, that's just the renter and the landlord. I'm going to try to stick to landlord, renter, business owner, landlord, that kind of thing. Contract law is interesting in that when you make a contract, you can decide that you want to use the law of any of the states that you want to, or sometimes even foreign countries to apply to that contract. And so that's what a choice of law provision is when I mentioned that. Usage is, as you would guess, what you can use the property for. That's often one of the heavily negotiated kind of things in a commercial agreement. Sometimes that's going to be things like zoning and hazardous materials and things like that. I know that we are entering a space in Ohio where we're starting to have some marijuana related businesses, and there's always some kind of uncertainty about how that may be in a lease, since we're still in a place where that's illegal under federal law and differing varieties of legality under state law. And some of those clauses are really broad to just say no illegal activity. And so that can be the kind of thing that you want to look at. And mandatory arbitration, people might have heard of arbitration before. It is when you make an agreement in a contract that says instead of being able to go to court, you're going to go to a private sort of judicial forum where an arbitrator decides things, or a panel of arbitrators. It can be good or bad, depending. If you really agree to arbitration, then I think it's okay. When you get stuck with arbitration, that's when it gets much more problematic. So it's always something to be watching out for. I'm going to start with the most immediate kind of concern that people have, and that's going to be what it's going to cost you. There are lots of different ways that commercial leases might phrase their costs. So almost all of us have lived somewhere before. So I do a lot of comparing to residential leases because maybe we've signed 2, 3 residential leases. What we're used to there is basically they say it'll be this much for this unit. It'll be $1,000 for a 1-bedroom, or $2,500 for a 3-bedroom, or whatever they say it's going to be. For commercial space, there are a lot broader options than that. So one of them might just be it's this per square foot. So it is $12 per square foot. And then you figure out how many square feet are there to get the base rent. One thing you want to look out for is what kind of measurement of square feet they're talking about. Because it might be usable square feet, which is all of the space that is available, including whether you can really use it or not. I wish that there was a term for that better than usable square feet, because it might include, a blank space that you can't actually put anything. Maybe it's a second floor space and there's a stairwell there. USF is going to measure that as part of the square footage that you're renting. So just something to be aware of. RSF is everything you rent. So thinking about it in terms of, I'm going to use like an office suite as an example. So say you are a massage therapist and you're renting your area where you're going to be doing your massage therapy, but you've also got use of the shared kitchenette, shared waiting room, that kind of thing. Rentable square feet is going to be all of that. And BOMA here is the Building Owners and Managers Association. It's a nationwide trade group. Their rules are the most common. So you often see this. One thing, especially for new businesses, I like to have people look out for when you're talking about just a per square foot rate, is that you may be able, and this is very common, to be able to have this kind of scale up over time. So maybe the first year of your lease will be at $9 a square foot, but your additional each year afterward, when you're expecting your business to have grown, maybe it goes to 12 per square foot or 13 per square foot. And that can be the kind of thing that lets a small business get started with lower costs, and then increase costs as income increases. And that can be really helpful sometimes. So, and then this little equation down there shows you kind of how those different things may end up, how those different calculations would work, how you can get from that, the calculation for that rentable square foot when you talk about common areas, because of course you don't pay for all of the common area because you're not the only one using it. Now, another thing that can be helpful sometimes for small businesses is that maybe it's something per square foot, but then a percentage of gross receipts. So what I mean by that is maybe you get a lower square foot price, but you also say plus 2% of any gross receipts over, a floor. The reason that you might do that, or that you might try to get that in a lease, would be until you've got customers, you're not really making any money. And your business plan has you needing to make a certain amount. But then anything above that can start to pay for like some kind of bonus or some increased things. So this might be a way that if it's going to take you a little bit of spool up time to get your customer base really in place, but after that, you expect that you'll really take off, this might be a way to secure a better space than you could otherwise afford at the beginning of your business. That then you'll be paying what it's really worth as your business succeeds. Now, the landlord's perspective on it is going to be, I'm not guaranteed those additional receipts unless this really works out. So it would end up requiring that you are in touch with a landlord who is willing to share some of that risk of your business working out. So that would especially be one that if they're in a business in addition to just owning the building. So if their whole business is purely being a landlord, they might not be as interested in this. But if they own the building and they've got their business location in part of that building, and you're looking at another part, and they figure as you grow, that's going to drive people to them because your businesses are compatible that way, they might be more likely to want to be involved in this kind of relationship. Mainly, I like to show people these two things because they show you some of the flexibility that is available in commercial leasing. Because if you're not aware of it, there's a whole world of possibilities that are kind of shut off to you. If you're thinking about it only in terms of, I'm going to pay this much per the space. Now, as you're price shopping, the other thing to look out for is going to be most commercial leases are going to have what's called a CAM, or an additional rent, is how the provisions are often labeled. What that means is you're going to pay some base price for the space, just the bare space. But you're likely to end up paying for some share of the things like utilities, the taking upkeep on the parking lot, upkeep on if there's landscaping around it, if there's common areas that get cleaned, that kind of thing. Now, there is kind of you'll see on the next slide, there's a whole spectrum of where this can be. But what you can do is negotiate along that spectrum. So you can get it more toward being gross, where you pay as close to a flat rate as possible, and some things are included that the landlord pays. Now, that gives you the benefit of exactly what you're going to be paying, and you're not going to be paying extra on top of it. But it is going to be a higher amount. Or you can get more toward that net, which is my base rent is going to be low, but I do know that I'm going to be dealing with the costs for those other things. And I think this chart will help give you an idea. So on that gross side, which I've got here as full service, the tenant pays just base rent, the landlord pays everything else. And then on triple net, which is the thing that I see most commonly, the tenant is paying their base rent plus some proportionate share of utilities, taxes, insurance, and repairs. So they are paying, and the way that normally works is you have base rent, plus you have this CAM charge, which is going to be that triple net. And you pay that CAM charge every month. And then at the end of the year, if you've paid more than those expenses actually were, you get that as a credit toward the next year. And if you've paid less, you've got to make that up. As I think everyone can tell from that description, there is some risk to that. You have the risk that at the end of the year, you find out that it's more than you thought that it was. The thing is, it's in the landlord's interest to make sure that it's not more than they've been charging you for, because they run the risk of not getting paid that. They would rather have, much like the government, they would rather have the money in their hands and have to give you a credit for it in the next year, than have to chase you down for it at the end of the year, just kind of like with taxes. So normally, I've seen more often that the CAM charge is higher than it needs to be, than that it is lower than it needs to be. This also bears the risk of, especially things like insurance and repair, those costs are often very out of your control, and you're kind of at the mercy of what people are charging the landlord for those. The good thing is you can kind of balance those all along that spectrum. So you can have a situation where you say, I think I'm comfortable with you paying insurance and repair, and I want to pay my share of utilities and taxes, so that I've mitigated that risk some. Or you can say, you know what, I don't want to have to set any of that up. I'm just going to go triple net. Or I've got plenty of money for rent, and it is more important that I know exactly what I'm going to be paying every month. Can we slide it this way so that I know everything's fixed, even if it's going to be a higher cost, just for my business to be more predictable for me. I like to show people what these provisions look like, so that you know what they might look like in a contract. And so you see this: agrees to directly or reimburse lessor for advance payments, 100% of all costs of operating and maintaining the building. So, and then it gives a list of what all those things are. That's an example of a triple net. If it were going to be, a double net or a modified gross, you'd see that percentage be different, and you'd see this list of things being shorter. And those are things you can absolutely negotiate over. The other thing to look out for in a situation like this, if it's a triple net and it is a place where you are going to occupy the only space left out of multiple spaces, you can know that you're at least going to split that with lots of people. So for example, when I had my private office, I had an additional office in another city. And it was important to me to keep the costs there low. That lease was a triple net lease, but my additional rent was very, very low because the proportionate space in the building that I had was 2%. So I was paying 2% of those total costs, whereas there was a bigger tenant that occupied half the building. They were paying 50% of those costs. And so that worked out for me. It was perfect. I was only there 1 day a week anyway. But I needed to maintain that location. So it was a good balance of risk to give you a firm example of how that kind of thing works out. Much like with residential properties, repairs are a huge, huge deal. You absolutely want to see and document the condition before you move into a commercial space, because for a few reasons. First, you want to know, is there anything that I'm going to make them have to fix before I move in here? Because it's going to be a problem if I've been in business for 2 months and this thing is still broken and it's affecting my customers and affecting my business. And you may make some changes, and the lease may mean that if you make changes, you've got to put everything back the way it was. So you need to document how it was when you moved in. You always want to look at the lease and see who's responsible. I have seen this all over the spectrum. I have seen this where landlords have tried to say that the tenant is responsible for all repairs, including the roof and the outside of the building, which when you're only occupying part of the building, doesn't make any sense at all. Those are things that I think are really not usually in the best interest of a business that's leasing part of a building to be responsible for. If you've got the whole building, maybe that's a different story. All the way up to we fix everything and we've already priced that into the rent, and anywhere in between. So definitely negotiate that at the beginning. Figure out what the condition of that property is, what you need it to be, what things are likely to break. If this is a 50-year-old building with an original roof, then you don't want to be responsible for that roof because it's probably going to go soon. That kind of thing. On the other hand, don't push the price down too far by taking on all the repairs if that's not something that you can actually get a good cost on. So if you've got great relationships with people who do repair work that will cut you deals and everything else, then maybe it's more worth it. But if you don't, that sudden repair cost, even if you're paying a lower rent every month, you get hit with that sudden repair cost and it can absolutely devastate your business because maybe it has to be done right now. I'm trying to watch the chat as it rolls by. Okay. This is what a repair provision might look like. I like this one pretty well. Tenant repairs all the necessary things, walls, floors, ceilings that are damaged or used during your occupancy, except for major mechanical systems in the roof. So that's things like the HVAC, the roof, if there's an elevator system, that kind of thing. I like that provision pretty well for most people because it's basically a you break it, you buy it kind of thing. Especially would be good for a relatively new kind of commercial space, maybe strip mall space. Would be a really good provision for that. This is a weird concept. And what you've got to know is property law when it comes to, renting real estate of any kind, um, still is very much based on things that happened in England before America was a country. So this whole concept of ameliorative waste, and ameliorative just means something that makes something better, um, is changing something, even changing it to be better or to add value, is not something that a tenant is allowed to do without permission. So the classic kind of English law example is, someone was the tenant on a big plot of farmland, and it had always been cow pasture, but the tenant planted an apple orchard. Most people would say an apple orchard was better than pasture land because it makes you more money. But the landlord didn't ask for that. Landlord didn't approve it. And so the tenant can be responsible for having to remove that orchard and restore it back to pasture. The real lesson out of this is, if you're going to change something, if you're going to be building inside a space, doing build out, make sure that you get the permission to do that in writing, so that first, exactly what you've got to do if you've got to put it back. And that there's no question that you had permission to do it. Because you don't see this a lot. Most places are more than willing to be like, well, they made it better, so okay. But it can pop up. And so it's something to make sure you're just protected against, and relatively easy to protect against by asking and getting permission. When you are going to make improvements, make sure you're negotiating over that. If you're paying for it, make sure that you are getting a lower rent, for example, because you're improving the space. If you're taking this right here and you're making it a usable space, you absolutely should be getting some kind of a discount for the investment you're making in their property. And so that can be things like, the first 3 months where you're not doing business yet, you're just making the improvements you need to be able to do your business. Maybe those first 3 months are free. So you're occupying the space, it's yours. But all you're doing is making the repairs and getting it ready, putting in your fitting rooms or whatever you've got to put in. Make sure that you get that scope of work defined, especially if the landlord is the one who is going to be doing the work. That way it's done to the specifications that you need them to be done to. And fixtures is what we call the things that are going to be there pretty permanently. So you install a bunch of mirrors and sinks because you run a salon. Those mirrors and sinks would be pretty destructive to pull back out of there at the end of the lease. So make sure you know whether they're going to expect that you leave them there, and that that you're going to have to make arrangements for that at your next space, or whether that's a thing that you can take with you. And the less destructive it would be to remove, the more likely that it'll be something you can take with you. If you've got business fixtures, if you've got things that are essential to your business, say some manufacturing machinery, maybe big 3D printers, those are things that you're much more likely to be able to take with you as being not fixtures. Signage ends up being a big deal some places, especially if you're going to be in like a historic area or a suburb that have lots of signage rules. Make sure, and sometimes leases have extra provisions about signage. Like you can't have any kind of sign that is bigger than 8 by 11, or you can't have any sign that we don't approve before you put it up. So make sure that you work that in to your negotiations. If you have spent a lot of time on your branding and your logo, and things like that, and that's going to be an important part of customers recognizing your business, make sure that you can have that up and be using it. If you're in an area that has really tight sign restrictions, you may end up having to figure out what you're going to have to do about that. Do not count on looking around and seeing what signs other people have. This beer one reminds me of an example that I had at one point where I had a business that I was representing that was in the downtown area of a suburb. And there was a local bar nearby that had this really big sign. And my client looked at it and said, well, how come I can't have a really big sign? Well, it turned out that really big sign had been there for 60 years, and the zoning rules that said you couldn't have big signs had only been in place for 30 years. So that other business could have that big sign. As long as they didn't tear it down and rebuild it, they were fine. But my client couldn't, and it didn't have anything to do with the landlord. It had to do with the law in the local area. And so it's an example of just looking around won't always give you all of the information. I'm a big fan of talking to nearby businesses about things like that, because just like people in any line of work, business owners gossip with each other and talk about the history of the area and whatnot. And a lot of times you'll be able to find out, well, so-and-so has that because they worked at a deal 20 years ago, or at one point their cousin was on city council and got it approved for them, but none of the rest of us have ever been able to. Things like that. And you can do exhaustive research to find those things out. But sometimes just going, hey, I'm looking at moving in next door. What can you tell me about the neighborhood? How are the other businesses around here? That kind of thing is a conversation that most people are happy to have, because everybody wants the businesses around them to send them work to. Common areas are great because it's space that maybe you only need some of, or the only need to be able to use some of the time, things like waiting rooms and whatnot, but they come with risks. So make sure that your business insurance covers the common areas. That way, if you get sued for something that happens in a common area, you've got some protection there. That is usually not going to be at the same price as the coverage for the areas you have sole control over. If you see any kind of a dangerous condition, a leak, carpet that's in disrepair that somebody could trip over, any of those things, make sure that the building management knows about it right away. Because if somebody is there to see your business or gets hurt, or they happen to come in for another business, but your sign is bigger and they get hurt, you may be the person they decide to sue rather than who they actually should. And what I always tell people about insurance is one of the best things about it is it will pay for a lawyer if you get sued by somebody who shouldn't have sued you. It doesn't just pay claims that you're responsible for. It pays to help make sure you're not responsible for claims. And sometimes that is worth more money than the things you're actually responsible for. I've talked about CAM. Sometimes you can do kind of a year-to-year cap, like that it won't increase more than 5% in a year. The current climate, it's hard to do that because inflation is so high, and landlords are a little worried about capping those things because all the costs are going up. But normally that's not a huge ask. So if we get inflation back under control here in the US, we may see that be an option that people are more likely to want to go to. If there's a shared parking area, figure that out. If you've got a business that people need to come to, you may need to negotiate for some designated spots. I've seen that be much more popular recently than it was in the past. And anybody who goes out to shopping centers has probably seen the same trend. I see more and more of these reserved parking spots than I ever did before, especially with carry-out parking and stuff that people started really doing during the pandemic. So that may not matter for your business at all. Maybe you need to be in a commercial space, but you don't have a lot of people come to you that way. Maybe you don't have as much of a need, or maybe you see a population who's more likely to need accessible parking. And so you want to see if a parking lot of a certain size has to have a certain number of accessible spots designated. You might want to see if those spots can be relocated closer to your door than where they are, so that your customers, your clients can get to you easier if you know that's a group of people that you serve. Sometimes there's a merchants association in a place or a promotion fund where everybody pays in $50 or $100 a month to benefit all of you together. That would absolutely be in the lease that exists. If it does, it's a good thing to go around and talk to the other tenants in the area, in the strip mall, for example, and see what they think of it, whether they think it's a helpful thing or whether they think it's money that doesn't do anybody any good before you end up getting into that lease. Just like you might need to if you're in an area with a homeowners or a condo association. When you're talking about being in these strip malls or spaces where there are more businesses, sometimes it can be good to have either a co-tenant or a competitor clause. So the co-tenant clause was something that contributed to the demise of like Northland Mall and Eastland Mall, if you've been in Columbus for long enough to remember either of those and how they kind of lost a lot of businesses. Many of those leases said that if the anchor stores, then that used to be Lazarus, JCPenney, Sears, if those are no longer there, then I get to get out of my lease. Because the idea was people are coming to the mall to go to Lazarus, JCPenney, and Sears, and as they're walking from one to the other, they'll pass my shop and come into my shop. If people are no longer being brought in by those big names, this is not a place that is useful for me to be. So co-tenant clauses can be good for that. I don't know that those are as essential as they used to be or as important as they used to be. Competitor clauses can be spectacular. I'll give you a great example of a competitor clause that I saw a few years ago that was handy. So near where my spouse grew up, there is a pizza place and a Subway that are almost neighbors. They're like the pizza place is in the corner and the Subway is in a weird little L shape around the pizza place. Well, Subway started selling pizza a few years ago. I don't know if they still do or not, but they started offering pizza. Well, we went in and that Subway had a sign that they weren't selling pizza. It turned out that the pizza place that had been there for a long time had one of these competitor clauses that said that that the landlord would not lease to any other place that was selling pizza, and would include in the leases for those other places that none of them could sell pizza, so that they were the only one there. That way they never had a competitor in their same immediate area. And that can be really useful if you're one of those businesses where people could come to you or the person next door, and it probably doesn't matter much to them which place they get it from. That can be a good way to negotiate that to protect yourself. Or it's something to look out for in your lease. So those are both clauses that can be neat and that I just don't think very many people realize they exist until you hear about one. And here's an example of one of those co-tenant clauses. You can see, look, if occupancy of this space is less than 85% for more than 6 months, I can either pay the lesser of my regular rent or 10% of my gross sales until occupancy goes back up. So that's if we're less full than we used to be as a community, my sales are going to suffer, so my rent ought to go down until you can get enough people to get occupancy back up. And here's an example of that opposite situation where landlord is representing, which means they're saying that it's true under penalty of law, that nobody else has an exclusive use, doesn't conflict with the exclusive use granted in other leases, and agrees that in the future, it won't grant an exclusive use privilege to anybody else that would prevent me from continuing to use the premises. So that's not providing monopoly, but it is guaranteeing that no one else has one and that they won't give anyone else one while you have a lease. So that can be a helpful way. And I'll make sure that I share these slides so that they can be sent out to participants. I realized that I didn't do that yet, so I'll make sure that I get that done. Insurance. I'm sorry, I'm muted somehow, and I don't know exactly how. Insurance is super important, and what I like to tell people about insurance is if you are a home-based business right now, you should definitely check with your agent about getting a rider to make sure that you're covered for business uses inside your home, because it's probably excluded. Most regular homeowners or renters insurance policies exclude any business use you have. So that's something that you really want to make sure that you get dealt with. As you move into other spaces, you definitely want to talk about how your insurance needs might have changed. There may be a minimum of coverage that you have to have in your lease. So a lot of times I'll see that tenant agrees that tenant will have a minimum of $1 million per occurrence, $2 million per claim, kind of. I'm sorry, the other way around. A 1 million, 2 million kind of amount of coverage, or a 200,000, 500,000 level of coverage. That way you can make sure you have that in place. And then business interruption insurance became really important for lots of people during COVID, and workers' comp and alterations and additions for building that you do can all be really important. If you're going to do a booth lease, and I'll be able to get through the last of these pretty quickly here. If you're going to do a booth lease, those can be great. They work pretty much the same as all the things that we've talked about. They're just for smaller space, and they tend to have shorter terms. Instead of that 3-year, 5-year term, they're more likely to be month to month or week to week. And they're more likely for your rent to be a percentage of your sales. These are most common in kind of personal service businesses, but I think that we'll see them a little bit more in some other areas as people try to figure out what we're going to do with workspace, as we figure out how the economy's changed because of the pandemic. Pop-ups are interesting. Pop-ups can often be kind of casual in the way they're set up. I don't think that they should be, but because they're a newer concept, sometimes there's just not as much in place about them. So the main things to really watch out for is make sure if it's going to be a pop-up and you're going to be there, we're doing a week here, we're doing 2 weeks here, that you're not being responsible for anything long-term, because you are a blip in time in this space. Your business isn't a blip, but you occupying this location is a very short amount of time. And your impact on it should be very small. And that definitely ought to be accounted for in the lease. So if you're on the hook for some kind of maintenance of that space and you're only going to be there a week, that's kind of ridiculous, because nothing that happens there in that week is likely to be as a result of what you're doing. Make sure that if you need permits for the activity you're doing, you seek those out and everything. Don't assume that your rental of the space means all of those things are taken care of. I cannot say this enough. Absolutely everything about your lease really needs to be in writing and signed by the landlord. The legal reason for this is that there's a law called the Statute of Frauds. That's a terrible name for it because it doesn't have anything to do with fraud. It is a law that says these kinds of contracts have to be in writing or they're not enforceable. Real estate contracts have to be in writing or they're not enforceable. So make sure any changes, any additions, any revisions, anything they waive, any permission they give you, everything is in writing and identifiably from the landlord or the landlord's agent. Because otherwise you run the risk of not being able to hold them responsible for it. The practical reason for this is if it's written down, there is no disagreement about what you said. There can only be disagreement about maybe what you meant. And it at least gives you a place to start if down the road you don't agree on what that meant. And it lets you be able to figure out with some kind of predictability. As a lawyer, I really hate dealing with an oral contract because I don't know whether the judge is going to believe my client or the other person's client about what they agreed to. A written contract, I can at least read it and go, all right, here are the couple ways the judge might read it. And here's our chance that we can argue that the judge should read it our way. You know, planning, if you're going to be in business, you absolutely understand how important planning is. And I know Women's Business Center does a great job with helping people and resources for business plans. But that planning is something you should be thinking about as you go through the lease. Am I probably going to expand? Am I going to outgrow this space quickly? What do I do if I outgrow this space? How do I get out of this lease if I need to? What if there are repair needs that are going to cause my business to shut down for a couple of weeks? And I'm in a line of business that if I'm unavailable to my customers for a couple of weeks, they're going to find someone else. Maybe that's a time when you make sure that the repairs let you do the repairs and instead of having to get the landlord to do it. Plan for what's going to happen if you renew. So if this is going to be a space that you want to be in long term, then you may want to lock in renewal plans. Having that ability to know that they're going to have this space likely rented for longer is something that the landlord would like to have. So you do have some leverage there. You've always got to kind of gauge it against whether rents are on an upswing or a downswing. And sometimes that's hard to project, but being able to say, you know what, we'll do 3 years and then we'll do an option for renewal for another 3 years with a 2% increase or a 3% increase is a way for you to be able to plan further into the future and for the landlord to be able to say, I know I'm going to have a tenant because that's what they want. If you default, if you can't pay, you do not have the same rights as a residential tenant. They can, as soon as you are not paying, unless you've got a cure period built in or something else in the lease, they can run to eviction court and get you put out quickly. So when you start to have a problem, make sure that you're on top of that as quickly as possible. I know I've had clients in that situation or people that have called me to try to become my client. In that situation, I have said, instead of messing around with me and trying to find a legal solution to this, go over to the Women's Business Center, see if they can help you with some short-term financing or one of the other business financing resources. If this is a short-term gap, see if there's a way to cross it that way. Because our housing team here at the Legal Aid Society does a spectacular job of protecting residential tenants. But they have the benefit of there are at least some laws on their side there that protect residential tenants. In a commercial sense, the only thing that protects you is what's in your contract. So that's the number one thing I want people to know about that. Sometimes there'll be a confession of judgment paragraph. I hate these. You can sign one if you want to. Some places will insist that everyone do it. What it is, and I'll show you what it looks like here, is it says, if I default, landlord, you can go hire any attorney you want who will represent me and agree that you have a judgment against me for whatever amount that I haven't paid, plus attorney's fees, plus everything else. So there won't be a court process. I won't get a day in court. I won't even get notice until you have already gone and gotten a judgment. I don't like them at all. I think they ought to be unethical. I think they ought to be illegal, but they're not illegal. They absolutely can be there. And this is what they look like. And do not sign one unless this absolutely is the space that you have to be in, and they will not negotiate it away. Often landlords will, but sometimes they won't. And I have had plenty of clients decide, you know what, that is too much of a risk. I'm going to walk away from this and try to find a different space. But they're legal in Ohio. People can do them. So you may see them, and I want you to know what they are, because I have had too many people that have signed them and not known that was what they were doing. They're supposed to be kind of separate. A best practice for them, for lawyers who are going to do them, is to have them on a separate page or like delineated somehow. But it's easy when you're signing a bunch of stuff all at once to not notice it. I know somebody had asked for my email and contact information. Like I said, I will send out these slides. I also see there's a question here about a resource to find commercial properties easily. I don't really have one. Real estate agents, if you can find a commercial real estate agent that you would trust, they can be great. Many real estate agents that deal mostly with residential real estate are also have subscriptions to the MLS to see commercial properties that become available. They just don't deal with it very often because there's just not as much work there as there is in residential stuff, unless you kind of specialize in commercial. So if you've got a real estate agent that you trust, that'd be a good person to talk to. I can't say that there's any kind of company that maintains a database that I would trust, or a particular website that I would trust to find good ones. That's just the thing there.